Hello, and welcome to episode 1 of a new Evilkind series we will be producing content for in both video and podcast formats. Our aim is to cover a range of interesting and compelling true crime stories while injecting our distinct flavor into the mix. If you're new to Evilkind, we are a retail brand and content producer focused on the betterment of your body, mind, and soul. We view the world through what we like to call a neo-Christian lens and believe in full that we are a fallen race, maneuvering through a broken, defiled, unchaste world, and that each and every one of us harbors our own particular brand of evil. As the good book does say, there is no one that is righteous, not even one. But why do some of us fall much harder than others? That's what we intend to focus in on as we explore notable criminal acts, criminal behavior, and true crime personalities that have certifiably dropped the shock and awe with their wicked and immoral ways. So without further ado, let's smash that sacrificial bottle over the bow and kick off this maiden voyage right about now. Dr. Amy Bishop. Today we're diving into the Amy Bishop story. It's not a whodunit story because we know who did it. Amy Bishop did it. What did she do? Very bad things. Why? Let's get into it. Back in February of 2010, Amy Bishop was a 44-year-old assistant biology professor at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. She had been teaching there for 7 years, and prior to that was an instructor at Harvard Medical School. She grew up in Massachusetts, completed her undergrad degree at Northeastern University in Boston, and earned a PhD in genetics from Harvard. She was, and apparently still is, married to James Anderson, a childhood sweetheart, and they have 4 kids. In 2009, Bishop applied for tenure at the U of A and was denied. She was also informed that her contract would likely not be renewed, which would put her out of a job by March 2010. Such denials were rare, as tenure-tracked professors at this school were monitored closely and alerted to areas needing improvement. That said, colleagues stated her research and publication record had not been strong. Faculty members, including her department chair, counseled her to look for another job, but ultimately she chose to take a more combative stance. As a former colleague of hers, Eric Seaman, commented, quote, "Her attitude was not, 'I'm going to have to find another job.' It was more like, 'When are these idiots going to clear this up?' After repeated attempts to appeal with no success, it was clear her fate at this school was sealed. A friend and colleague in her department, Deborah Moriarty, who had actually voted against her tenure, but remained cordial and somewhat chummy, had also relayed that Bishop had expressed despair over the ruling and had at one point even said, quote, 'My life is over.' Our modern world is obsessed with success, achievement, financial gain. For most folks, intrinsic value is tied directly to professional stature and income, even in the world of academia. Tenure, though a dying institution in the age of COVID, and as universities have been continuing to inflate their faculties with expendable adjunct professors, tenure is still highly coveted, and rightly so. Intellectual freedom, job security, perks, peace of mind, all things to be desired in a volatile, uncertain, precarious world such as ours. At 44, after 7 years of paying dues to what she felt was rightfully hers, she would have to start all over somewhere else. She took great pride in her Harvard education. She was reportedly imperious by nature, and those who came across her could clearly see she held a very high opinion of herself. In the aftermath of the drama to ensue, her husband would later reveal to the press and to the cops that Dr. Bishop's tenure denial had been a profoundly distressing period in her life, as they both considered her to be exceedingly qualified for the placement. So why didn't she get that which she so desired? Where did it all go wrong? How could someone so educated, so seemingly normal, intelligent, suburban, and peacefully middle class, at least on paper, go so rogue? As folks would later grasp, for answers and search for clues, certain friends from her circle would describe her as having a biting wit, a notable sense of humor, and a higher level of empathy than most. But indubitably, this wasn't the whole story, because what was also revealed in subsequent investigations was that Dr. Amy Bishop had a very acute dark side and stood far from normal in psychological profile. For maximum effect, it would behoove us to work backwards chronologically from the time of the event that brings Amy into sharp focus to a period in her young adulthood where things took a dramatic turn for the worst and began to go devastatingly wrong. Because the fact of the matter is that Dr. Amy Bishop, now 55 years old and serving a life sentence with no possibility of parole, has likely never been truly well or quote-unquote normal. She's claimed in recent years that she's suffered from schizophrenia, but that doesn't quite line up with the course of her life. If anything, intermittent explosive disorder would come closer to the mark, but let's explore, dive into her psyche, and make our way full circle back to the beginning of this piece, to the tragic day that would fully crystallize Amy Bishop's spot in the annals of true crime history back in February of 2010. Underneath the surface and behind the veil of the perceived capacity for empathy, Dr. Amy Bishop was reportedly a ticking time bomb, a swirling heap of frenetic rage drifting from one bizarre encounter to the next. The more they looked, the more they found former colleagues, acquaintances, and students all eager to paint her as someone who was most certainly capable of snapping, sometimes violently and disproportionately, at the smallest of slights. She was known to yell at children playing, to vehemently reject criticism, to never refrain from sharing her opinions, and was one to lie on her resume and or overstate the truth. Former students of hers described a pattern of, quote, flip-outs, which led to one grad student after another being pushed out of her lab. Others who had worked with her in a more intimate creative writing group characterized the experience as painful and said they always had a feeling she was about to explode. In 2002, Amy Bishop lost it at an IHOP in Peabody, Mass. A random woman happened to take the last booster seat. Bishop insisted that her party had arrived at the restaurant first, so she confronted the woman angrily and demanded the booster seat for one of her children, while shouting, "I am Dr. Amy Bishop." She then proceeded to punch this woman in the face. She was charged with assault. In 1996, Dr. Bishop, who had been collaborating with Dr. Hugo Gonzalez-Cerratos on a paper while they were both working in the cardiology department at a Harvard-affiliated medical center in Boston, flew into an unholy rage upon learning her name was not listed as the first author. She broke down, Dr. Gonzalez-Cerratos recalled, stating, quote, "She was extremely angry with all of us. She exploded into something emotional that we never saw before in our careers," end quote. Needless to say, her contract was not renewed. In 1993, she and her husband, James Anderson, were veritable suspects in an attempted mail bombing case involving a Dr. Paul Rosenberg, Bishop's former supervisor and mentor at a children's hospital neurobiology lab. Rosenberg had received a package containing 2 pipe bombs that failed to explode. Bishop and Rosenberg had been involved in some kind of dispute after she was given a poor evaluation due to the substandard quality of her work. She voluntarily resigned, but had reportedly been quite upset and, quote, on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Her husband James, who will now clearly emerge as her chief enabler, allegedly confessed to a witness that he wanted to, quote, shoot, stab, or strangle Rosenberg, end quote, prior to the attempted bombing. Ultimately, the witness couldn't be verified. Bishop and Anderson refused to cooperate with the authorities, at one point denying entry to their home and refusing to take polygraphs, and miraculously, the case went unsolved due to a lack of evidence. Clearly, we are establishing a pattern of bizarre behavior here, where Bishop was allowed to go on with her life virtually unchecked, and enabled by her husband acting in ways that were consistently impulsive, angry, aggressive, and all too often, violently explosive. Again, modes of behavior very compatible with intermittent explosive disorder, but wholly incongruent with schizophrenia. Schizophrenics are unable to foster close relationships as they drift in and out of touch with reality, requiring heavy medication. Bishop was able to get married and went on to have 4 kids, and I would guess legitimate schizophrenics rarely earn doctoral degrees from Harvard. What is so sadly evident in retrospect is that all of these encounters, including the tragic loss of life to come, could possibly have been avoided or prevented had action been taken to diagnose and treat Bishop's damaged psyche after a most unfortunate incident that took place when she was just a young lady about to pass into adulthood. Which brings us to the winter of 1986. Amy Bishop was just 21 years old, still living with her parents and 18-year-old younger brother in Braintree, Massachusetts, while attending Northeastern University, where her brother Seth also went to school, and her father was a film professor. It was the morning of December 6th, and Amy and her father, Sam Bishop, had just gotten into an argument over something she had said. At around 11:30 a.m., Sam headed out to the mall to do some Christmas shopping, passing his son on his way out as he was washing his car on the driveway. Amy had retreated to her bedroom and for whatever reason had retrieved her father's 12-gauge pump-action shotgun from her parents' bedroom and was now loading it. She would later explain to the police that she was concerned about recent burglaries in the neighborhood and wanted to learn how to use it. This particular gun held multiple rounds and required a pump after every discharge, so not only did she load it with multiple rounds, she went ahead and fired it right in her room, blasting a lamp and a mirror and blowing a hole in her wall. She then tried to cover up the hole in the wall with a Band-Aid and book cover. After all that, with the shotgun still in hand, she descended down the stairs towards the kitchen. The official story of what happened next is based on Amy's mother's account of the event, as she claimed to have witnessed the whole thing. In her words, Judy Bishop told the police, quote, "I was at the kitchen sink and Seth was standing by the stove. Amy said, 'I have a shell in the gun and I don't know how to unload it.' I told Amy not to point the gun at anybody. Amy turned toward her brother and the gun fired, hitting him. Amy then ran out of the house with the shotgun." End quote. At such close range, the shot had blasted a gaping wound in Seth's chest. He was now bleeding out on the floor, gasping for air with a ruptured aorta and a decimated liver. Fighting for his life for almost an hour, he was pronounced dead by first responders at 3:08 p.m. By this time, Amy was long gone. Once again, for reasons still unknown, she had manically bolted from her house down the street, gun in hand, towards Braintree's commercial district. Amy was spotted at a Ford dealership where witnesses said she was frantically peering into cars looking for keys. One of the witnesses, a mechanic from the dealership's body shop, confronted her. He asked her, "What's going on? What are you doing here?" She, in turn, raised the shotgun at him and said, "Put your hands up." He complied and repeated his questions, and then, in a distraught, hyper-aware state, as he described it, Amy said, quote, "I need a car. I just got into a fight with my husband. He's looking for me, and he's going to kill me." The mechanic hesitated, and she took off. A police officer found her nearby at a newspaper distribution center, where workers were unloading Sunday's papers, in what he called a frightened, disoriented, and confused state of mind. The officer ordered her to drop the weapon, to which she refused. She only complied when another police officer approached her from behind, presumably with his gun drawn. They found her with the shotgun still loaded and an unspent shell in her pocket. On the way to the station, Amy felt compelled to tell the officer she had been in an argument with her father prior to the shooting, a statement the deputy found surprising and remarkable, as indicated in his report. Cutting to the quick, when all was said and done, based on Judy Bishop's account of the events and the Bishop family's relationship to the community and to the police chief no less, charges were never filed, an investigation never ensued, and the Bishop family was left alone to grieve the horrifying loss of their son and brother, Seth. In retrospect, had things been handled properly and by the book, given her manic behavior following the shooting, Amy Bishop would have likely been charged with weapons and assault felonies that would have led to a thorough psychiatric evaluation. Had that taken place, lives could have possibly been saved some 20 plus years later, and we wouldn't be speaking of Amy Bishop now. But we are. History has been written, and Amy Bishop will forever be remembered for that grisly day at the University of Alabama on February 12th, 2010. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. 13 professors and staff members had just shuffled into a cramped, windowless conference room on the 3rd floor of the Shelby Center for Science and Technology. Dr. Bishop was seated by the door next to her department chair, 52-year-old Gopi Padilla, a fellow biology professor who was handing out the meeting's printed agenda. Normally vocal and more animated, today Bishop was silent and brooding. Much of the afternoon's meeting would focus on the following semester, but because her tenure had been denied and her contract was coming to a close, none of it would apply to her. From across the table sat her aforementioned colleague and friend, Deborah Moriarty, who clearly understood Bishop's plight and her sullen demeanor. At one point during the meeting, Deborah even asked Bishop how the job hunt was going, but she didn't get much of a response. The rest of the meeting proceeded as planned for approximately 55 minutes, and then just as the congregation was concluding, Amy Bishop abruptly stood up, reached into her purse, and pulled out a 9mm semi-automatic Ruger. She aimed the pistol directly at Padilla, and with no hesitation, shot him in the head. She fired again, striking Stephanie Monticello, a department assistant, and then turned her gun on Adriel Johnson, killing him instantly. With the room in total chaos and mayhem as people screamed and ducked for cover while Bishop blocked the only exit, Deborah Moriarty, in a half-dazed state of shell shock and panic, watched as Bishop then trained her weapon on a 4th colleague, Maria Raglan Davis. Ms. Davis was killed on the spot. Deborah Moriarty dove under the table as bullets continued to whiz above her, and in a frantic fight-or-flight state, she flung her arms around Bishop's legs, screaming and pleading, quote, "Amy, don't do this. Think of my daughter. Think of my grandson." Amy Bishop looked down at her colleague and friend, pointed the gun directly at her, and pulled the trigger. Click. Miraculously, the gun had jammed. Deborah managed to crawl past her and into the hallway. Bishop wasn't done with her and followed Deborah out into the hallway while repeatedly pulling the trigger in an attempt to unjam the gun. As Bishop fiddled with it, Deborah scrambled back into the conference room as another colleague barricaded the door. Amy's minute-long rampage was over, leaving what the prosecutor later said looked like a bomb went off, like a war zone. 3 people lay dead and 3 others badly wounded. Bishop fled to a downstairs ladies' room where she rinsed off the gun. She then ditched both the gun and her bloodstained blazer in a nearby trash can, and then calmly and coldly crashed a lab and asked a student to use his phone. She called her husband, who typically picked her up from work, and said, "I'm done." She was apprehended by a sheriff's deputy as she attempted to escape the Shelby Center through a loading dock in the back. In the aftermath of the killings, many struggled to come to terms with why she would do this. Her peers and colleagues at the University of Alabama had never witnessed her darker side in full bloom. As mentioned, she had fudged on her resume time and time again, never revealing any clues to her checkered past, and yes, she came off as a little elitist, quirky, and even arrogant with her Harvard background, but never had they suspected she could perpetrate such evil. Some tried to rationalize that the tenure made her do it. But months had passed since the initial denial, plus all the time spent maneuvering through failed appeals. When the dust had settled and all options exhausted, the final verdict dealt. It was 3 months prior to the shooting in February. It was hard for most to believe that she had stewed in her rage for that long of a period, and that this was the true catalyst for her murder spree, as she had even unloaded murder-death-kill on colleagues who had supported her. Some tried to chalk it up to her supposed idiosyncratic genius, reasoning that she was one of the few socially awkward, oddball geeks that also happened to be a maniac. People have certainly seen that before. But the fact of the matter, based on feedback from those who knew her and had worked or studied alongside her in days past, was that she wasn't that smart, that her work wasn't that special, and she likely wouldn't have even had the option to apply for tenure at the higher tiered schools. An Einstein, she was not. So what made this suburban educated mother of four go postal? Basic psychology doesn't really leave us with any answers, or solutions for that matter. Clearly, she had been afflicted with some type of mental disorder for the majority of her life, quite possibly from early childhood or even birth, but we'll never know. Was she abused physically, sexually, or emotionally? Did she suffer from some mind-altering trauma that set her on a path that would doom her to explode, like the ticking time bomb many described her to be? We'll never know. But does that mean events like these will always remain a mystery? Thought of as just a nasty aberration or inexplicable anomaly due to a chemical imbalance or faulty biological wiring? Questions like these bring us back full circle to the introduction of this new series and the fact that Evilkind views the world through a neo-Christian lens. What does that mean beyond the fact that we are believers? It means we understand our battle to not be against flesh and blood, but against the powers of the dark world, the spiritual forces in evil dimensions beyond our own. And what does that mean? It means that many of us live and die oppressed and degraded by potent, unseen, demonic influences. In the introduction to his book, Counseling and the Demonic, Dr. Roger K. Buford, a professor of psychology at George Fox University, writes, quote, "Throughout human history, the question of demonic influence has been a controversial one. It continues to be so now, when there are two widely held views. According to the first view, demons are everywhere. Those who believe this are preoccupied with demons and with efforts to appease, avoid, or escape them. The second view discounts demons, looking on them as irrelevant at best or even as non-existent. Both these views are mistaken. Unfortunately, reality is both less comfortable and more complex than either outlook permits." End quote. As he expounds further, and what generally comes naturally to our thought process based on our neo-Christian position, with a particular focus on the subject of evil, is that what we are up against is a mixture of the sinfulness of man and the diabolical, demonic, that requires full use of both human and spiritual elements to identify and treat social, psychological, and even physiological ailments. We live in a world where folks of all ages openly flaunt their occult ties to fortune-telling in the forms of astrology and tarot, to spell-casting and ritual in the forms of Wicca and other pagan religions and practices, and yet when it comes to the existence of the demonic in our 5G, AI, VR progressive environment, it's typically abject denial. News reports can literally throw testimony of hospital personnel witnessing a possessed child walking up a wall backwards and onto the ceiling like Spider-Man, and people will still deny it. Folks are more inclined to believe in Bigfoot, Mothman, and Slender Man than they are to believe in demons. This is probably also due in part to the fact that full-on demonic possession, including the extreme body contortions, levitation, superhuman strength, utterances of ancient languages, and the like, are rare. Not super rare, but definitely not something you see every day. What is much more prevalent, and likely a scourge in our world, is the reality of demonized humans. People engaging in habitual sin that basically gives legal right to demons to have influence over sectors of their personalities and their physical bodies. This, we would say, is rampant. From what we know of Amy Bishop's experience is that she suffered from rage tendencies, impulse control, and an inflated sense of self-worth for most of her adult life. Her rage went on to build to an intense and tragic crescendo until she basically self-destructed, completely ruining her life, taking 3 others, and traumatizing an entire community. The evil within her rippled out exponentially, leaving utter destruction in its path and everyone scratching their heads, wondering what the hell happened. Our view is that Amy Bishop was and likely still is a highly demonized person who was wholly nurtured and enabled by her husband. We can't say for sure, but it is our estimation that their relationship dynamic took on the Jezebel-Ahab configuration, where she was the controlling manipulator and he was the spineless yes man seeking love and validation from his surrogate wife-mother. The bottom line was that Amy really did feel her life was over in that moment. In her mind, professionally, she was done, and she wanted others to suffer and die for it. So narcissistically self-involved, never did her thoughts turn to her own kids, the trauma she would inflict on her own family. Whereas someone else in a similar position may have only dreamed and fantasized about revenge or payback, Amy had taken premeditated steps to carry out a plan she seemingly never had second thoughts about. This was evil inside of her, likely a legion that pushed and goaded, acting as that voice inside her head, calling out for blood, calling out for her soul, as the attachments were likely there since the first killing back in '86. Is redemption possible in such a scenario? I would assume so, but I really don't know. As we move forward with this series, we intend to look deeper into the relationship between mental disorder and the demonic dynamic as we further explore the true crime niche. But for now, we'd like to thank you for joining us for this first Maiden Voyage episode. We hope you enjoyed it, and until next time.